Hello everybody. Welcome to Creating the Basic Adaptable Game Engine Library, Part 21, Input Class Code. In the previous video, we talked about the design considerations that need to go into an input class. In particular, when we're thinking about video games, there's two different types of actions that happen in a video game. There are discrete actions, which happen at a particular instant in time, and continuous actions, which happen over an interval of time. However, most computer applications, most programming languages only monitor for discrete input, so we have to do a little bit of thinking and how to convert discrete input into continuous input. We also need to take into account that input events are handled asynchronously to the main thread of the program. So, all of that, we'll see how that gets implemented in the input class in this video. So we're going to turn our attention to some code. Let's go ahead and open up IntelliJ. First, we're going to create an input class. Let's right-click, make a new class called input. And first, we'll go ahead and declare a number of fields. These will all be array lists that store strings, the strings being the name of the keys that were pressed or released. So I'll start off with the just pressed Q. And I, of course, need to import that. Let's go ahead and import that class. And public array list string. We'll make this the just released queue. Again, these will be used to handle the results of the asynchronous function calls. And finally, we'll use three more lists. This will be the just pressed list. Then we'll have public array list string. Let's maybe say still pressed list. And finally, public array list string just released list. Right, and in our update function, when we query the input class to determine what's been just pressed and what's been just released or what is still being pressed, we'll actually be taking a look at the contents of these three lists. Okay, let's go ahead and set up a constructor which will initialize each of these lists. So public input. Now this will need to take a scene object as input. And let's go ahead and make sure that gets imported as well. Right, the scene is what monitors for keyboard or mouse input. So we'll call this maybe the listening scene. And here, the first thing we'll do is we'll initialize all of those array lists. So the just pressed Q is a new array list containing strings. You know, let's just copy paste this a bunch of times. Let's copy all these names down here. I also have the just released. Right, so all of those are set up. For some reason, I always like to line those up. Next, we're going to see how to handle keyboard input using Javafx. So, listening scene set on key pressed is the name of the function that we're going to call. And really what we'd like to do from kind of a general point of view is when a key gets pressed, we'd like to add something, the name of whatever key was pressed, to this queue right here. However, we think of that as an action we want to happen when a key is pressed. So it's kind of like we want to run a method or we want to run a function when this event is called. However, functions or methods are not first-class citizens in Java, which means I cannot pass a method as a parameter to another method. Instead, you can kind of see by the autocomplete here, is that this is looking for an event handler object. The event handler object would contain a method that would be called. Right, so it's almost like the parameter needs to be an instance of this class, because the classes are kind of wrappers for these functions. That's confusing, and that's a lot of syntax. So in recent versions of Java, they introduced something called Lambda Expressions. It's going to look like we're passing a function as a parameter, but really it's like a shorthand notation that when compiled would generate an anonymous inner class for us. So here, I'm going to create something. Let's say this is a key event. Let me type this in and then I'll explain what's happening here. All right, and I'm going to maybe bring this in. Can I bring this in a level of indentation? Maybe not. Then I'll get the key name from that event. Get the code converted to a string. And then I'll add that to the just pressed queue. All right, let me explain what the code is happening here. So the listening scene has a method called setOnKeyPressed, and that method is activated whenever you press a key and that scene has focus, right? So the window has focus. So really, we want to run a function. That function will take the data about the event as an input, and then it will run this code. Here, this symbol, which looks kind of like a hyphen or a dash and a greater than sign, that's supposed to look like an arrow, supposed to look like so-called functional notation. Take this input and then run the code stored between these braces. In this code, we take the data about the event, we get the key code, and we convert that to a human-readable string stored in this key name, and then add it to a queue. And we'll process that later at a convenient time through a function called update. So when this code is compiled, it's kind of interesting. Behind the scenes, this expression will get converted to a particular class that satisfies the parameter that this function takes. But it's very nice and readable like so. And at the very end, I need a semicolon. All right, so that'll handle when a key is pressed. That's one of the discrete events you can listen for. The other event that we need, first I need to go ahead and import this. So Alt-Enter. I want the key event class from Javafx. There we go. Now I need more code like this, except in this case I need a key released. So I'm going to copy paste that, change the name to setOnKeyReleased, and in this case I'll add the name to the just released queue. Again, same idea. No matter where your main application is in its code, if you press, or if the user presses some kind of key when the code is running, this function will immediately get called, store the name of the key, and we'll process that later in the input function. That being said, let's go ahead and maybe write an input function next. Or an update function, rather. The name of the class is input. All right, so that finishes the constructor. In the constructor, we initialize all of our lists, and we say what to do when the user presses or releases a key. Now let's go ahead and write the method update. Public void update. So what this is going to do is first, if it's a brand new update, right, another frame has gone by, I want to start by clearing any data from previous discrete events. Right? For instance, if a key was just pressed during the previous frame, during the previous iteration of the game loop, it's no longer pressed now. Just pressed is only true for one instant in time. So the just pressed list, I want to clear its contents, and the just released list, I want to clear its contents as well. Next, let's go ahead and update the current events based on data from the queues. Right, so we're going to go through each of the lists which serving as a queue. So for each string called key name in the just pressed queue, and this stores the names of all keys which have been pressed since the last time update was called. I want to go ahead and say, well, I want to avoid duplicates too. So as long as the still pressed list, if it contains this key name, in particular, I want to avoid duplicates. So as long as it does not already contain this key name, then let's say just pressed list. We can go ahead and add that key name. And still pressed list, we'll add that key name. Okay. And now I want to do something similar for the key releases. Right, so the same kind of for loop. It's a for each syntax. For each string, we'll call it key name in the just released queue. We're going to go ahead, we don't have to worry about duplicates in this case. Sometimes the key press event fires repeatedly if you're holding a key down. Right, like if I was to hold down the letter Z, right, I see a lot of Z's even though I'm not, tapping the key again and again. So that's why we need to be careful about duplicate keys in the press, but once you release it, it's just everything's done. So in this case, I can say the still pressed list, I can remove that key from it. And the just released list will add that key name. Now we don't need to remove the name of this key from just pressed because discrete events are automatically cleared at the beginning of the update function. Right, so this handles processing all the information which was stored in the queues. Finally, since we're done processing all that data that's been waiting for us, we're going to clear the queues. So we'll say just pressed queue dot clear and just released queue dot clear. Right, so after we process update, we process all that data that's been waiting for us, and then we move along with our lives. In this case, move along with our update function. Okay, that's all we need to do for update. Finally, the way we will use the update class, the way we will use the input class in our games is we want to check if a key has been just pressed or released, or if a key is still pressed. So we'll create a number of methods that return Booleans that check the contents of these lists. So for example, is key just pressed? And I'll take a string called key name. And I know in some languages, pressed implies a discrete event, but I'm saying just pressed to emphasize that fact, to hopefully avoid any confusion. This is most certainly refers to a discrete event. So in this case, all we really need to do is return true, right, if this key name is contained within the corresponding list. So we'll look in the just pressed list, and then we'll see if it contains the key name. Right? If it contains the key name, this will return true. If it doesn't, it will return false. For continuous events, we'll just call that isKeyPressed. I guess you could call it isKeyStillPressed, but that seems a little bit awkward in code. And additionally, since there is a method called isKeyJustPressed, hopefully it's clear that isKeyPressed refers to the continuous. I still do use stillPressedList, just because as a developer I find that a little bit easier. But I want the code to be more readable and less awkward for the user or other developers. That's why I chose that name. Finally, public boolean is key just released, string key name. Just like before, I don't know why I didn't just copy paste this again. We're going to look in the just released list to see if it contains that key name. Sure, all right, very good. So that completes the input class for now. Someday we might go back and add some mouse input functionality, but for now, this looks pretty good. In the next video, we'll see how to use this class to add it, kind of incorporate it into the game class. And then we'll change our test game example so that we can move around the basketball using the arrow keys. All right, that's it for this video. Thanks for watching.